Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The new JSSJ graduate-level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, equips professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources that organizations need to bridge generational gaps and ensure inclusive growth. Learn from renowned experts like Julia Watts-Belzer in her upcoming course, Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Apply for her class by May 15th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 426, Sephardic and Mizrachi Identities, Beyond Ashkenormativity. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and I'm not Dan Liebenson. We miss Dan Liebenson today. He, of course, is our other co-host generally, but he was not able to make it for our recording session, so he's not here for this episode. He's not going anywhere. He's not departing us. He will be back for our future episodes, but alas, he is not with us this week. So we miss Dan, but we'll see him soon. We'll hear him soon. I guess that's more accurate. One note before we get rolling, we are, of course, in the midst of our unit of episodes about disability Torah, and we will be returning to that next week. This episode, while it's not about disability and not part of that unit, it also is squarely focused on ways in which we, in our Jewish communities, can better expand the norms and boundaries of what is seen as Jewish and how we can more thoroughly empower people who have been marginalized. So in this case, that's folks who are not Ashkenazi from other types of Jewish experiences, especially Sephardic and Mizrachi Jewish experience. That means Jews whose roots trace to the Iberian Peninsula, Middle East, and North Africa. And next week, we'll be back looking at ways in which we do that along the axis of ability and disability. So in terms of today's guest, Hadar Cohen, she's one of our upcoming teachers in the Yeshiva. We have 3-week mini courses that we are offering in 2 blocks. The first beginning at the very end of April, just after Passover, and then the second starting in mid-May. This is one of our options in the first 3-week block. And we're excited to give you a sneak preview of it through this conversation. Hadar Cohen is a spectacular teacher, and we're thrilled to be featuring her in the Yeshiva. To sign up for her course, just head on over to judaismunbound.com/classes, which you can do right now. But if you're like, I gotta hear this episode to decide whether I'm going to take it, that's reasonable. But I'm very confident that at the end, you are going to want to sign up for this. So without further ado, a little bit more about Hadar Cohen. She is an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, and artist whose work focuses on multi-religious spirituality, politics, social issues, and community building. She's the founder of Malchut, a spiritual skill-building school teaching Jewish mysticism and direct experience of God. Cohen regularly translates her Jewish mysticism into multi-faith gatherings, including prayer groups bridging Jewish communities with Sufi Muslim communities. She led the first Sephardic Jewish mystical retreat to Andalusia, Spain, in summer 2023, and is the founder of Feminism All Night, a public gathering space for feminist spiritual discourse and possibility. Hadar's artistic works include Prostrations, a visual art show reflecting on Jewish devotional prayer practice, and the Slichot Project, a collection of her grandfather's tapes singing Sephardic Jewish liturgical prayers. Hadar is a 10th-generation Jerusalemite with lineage roots in Syria, Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran. She is currently pursuing her Master of Fine Arts at Trans Art Institute for Creative Learning. She's also a fellow podcaster, and her podcast, Hadar's Web, features conversations on spirituality, healing, justice, and art. Hadar Cohen, welcome to Judaism Unbound. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have a mini course coming up. You are going to be teaching about Sephardic and Mizrachi identities, Beyond Ashkenormativity. What's this course about? Why are you excited to teach it?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, it really is a course to expose a form of being Jewish that has been greatly both underestimated and kind of suppressed in a lot of Jewish spaces. So, we'll learn both about culture and traditions and music and what are some of the differences in Sephardic and Mizrachi practice and Ashkenazi one, and also what does it mean to also create Jewish spaces that are inclusive to Sephardim and Mizrachim. So, the class is really open to people of all identities, whether you are Sephardic and Mizrachi and want to learn more about your own tradition and your own culture, or you are Ashkenazi and want to learn more about, what it means to be Sephardic and Mizrachi. So we'll have some readings in the class and, songs and melodies that Sephardic and Mizrachi communities sing throughout the year. And also, a bit more about the cultural context of what it means to be Sephardic and Mizrachi. Recently over the summer, I led a Sephardic Jewish mysticism retreat in Andalusia and Granada, Spain. And it was so incredible because the retreat really centered around so many dimensions of being Sephardic, right? We did a lot of teachings of Kabbalah and what it means to have a more embodied relationship to Kabbalah, which I think is a Sephardic tradition. But it was also very much, right, learning about the different ways we cook, the different way we are around hospitality, some of this more just day-to-day life relationships. So this course it will be a bit of all of that, of integrating it.
I'm flashing to my last two Yom Kippur experiences. I was leading services on a college campus, and there were a few students who took on some leadership, which was really awesome. And shouts to Mateen. Mateen was one of them, and his family is from Iran. They're Iranian Jews. And he basically said to me, this was the best moment ever as like a guest leader on a college campus. Like, Lex, I'm going to take Ne'ilah. I'm going to take the last service of Yom Kippur. I'm going to do it myself. And the reason I'm going to do that is because my family and my community that I grew up in, which is largely Mizrachi, has this really deep relationship to that closing service, to Ne'ilah. And I want to share a bunch of melodies that people might not have heard before. There's a few that excite me. And I also just want to take that moment at the end of Yom Kippur and really mark the ways in which our intention as Jews, as we're trying to grow, as we're trying to be introspective, like, should be to empower voices, empower identities that have not been centered in Jewish life. And so, like, literally doing that as part of the high holiday experience and as like the punctuation mark is a really powerful way to do that. And it was amazing. I'm kind of curious to unlock, to name, like, what happens when we actually pave the path towards more diverse, more enriched Jewish experiences where we actually celebrate these voices. Because I think sometimes it sounds to people like, oh, we're doing this like charity act. Mm-hmm. Like, we Jewish communities that are in this country, mostly Ashkenazi, want to make space. We want to include, I don't know, that's a thought. Yeah. It's not as much a question, but like what actually happens when we take these traditions that are not as well known in Jewish life and center them?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for acknowledging that we are the fun ones. Because, definitely in the musical tradition, especially in Yom Kippur, right? So many of the tunes have so much joy and celebration, and the musical melodies, which are really centered in the makam system, right, which is an Arabic system of understanding music, is so exquisite. One of the things that I think people sometimes don't realize in the Jewish community is that Sephardic and Mizrachi communities have different prayer books than Ashkenazim. We literally have different prayer books, right? When you go to a Jewish store and you want to buy a prayer book, definitely if you're in Israel, then they ask you, do you want an Ashkenazi one, or do you want a Sephardic one, or do you want Edot HaMizrach? And I think that in the US, there's just been a complete flattening of even that choice. You go to a synagogue and you just assume that it's Ashkenazi. There's no even time to ask, right? Because the assumption is that it is Ashkenazi. And I think that there's an immense amount of loss there, not just about, inclusivity of people, but what it means for Jewish tradition itself. Jewish tradition is not just an Ashkenazi tradition. And I think that the Sephardic and Mizrachi lineage offers so much depth, so much beauty, and actually offers so much wisdom about the exact challenges that Jewish world is facing today. I think that there's so many things, and I particularly, work on some of them. For example, like the question of spirituality and embodiment, which I think is something that is very alive in so many Jewish communities. Is, what is our relationship to our body? What is our relationship to God? What is our relationship to experience of God? There's actually so many answers already in Sephardic Mizrachi lineages. And I find that sometimes in the Jewish world, we just kind of try to reinvent them in the modern, postmodern context. But it's like, well, why aren't we actually looking at some of the lineages there? And part of the reason why we're not is because we're not used to actually counting Sephardic Mizrachi lineages as part of Jewish tradition. For me personally, there's just such a deep heartbreak there. I'll also say that, It's especially with Sephardic Judaism, right? Andalusia, Kabbalah, like these are not just things that are on the side of Judaism. I mean, these are some of the major inventions across history and time and space, you know? So to just kind of dismiss it is so problematic to me because I mean, you could say Kabbalah. I grew up, in a Sephardic home that Kabbalah was like the heart of all Jewish tradition. So, Kabbalah being a lineage of Jewish mysticism, right? Because there's so many forms of Jewish mysticism, but I would say one of the major ones. And, even with Kabbalah, right, there's you have the early stage and you have the late stage. And one of the things that you can find, I mean, even in academia, is that so much of the research focuses on late stage Kabbalah as opposed to early stage. And part of the reason of that is because the late stage actually influenced the Ashkenazi communities more. And there's actually so much that is missing in the research about early stage Kabbalah that was purely Sephardic. Recently I was reading an academic book by a biblical scholar, and I had to stop reading it because in the first chapter, it really broke my heart reading this. I really did start crying because he was talking about pronunciation of Hebrew letters. And there was a little footnote that he wrote in the beginning about the sounds of the Ain and the Chet. And he basically was like, the original was really pronouncing them in this way, but there's no communities who practice it like this today. And it broke my heart. My grandfather sang with the guttural sounds of the Ain and the Chet, right, which is a bit more of the Mizrachi tonality. And the fact that an academic is just like completely dismissing the Mizrachi community in terms of their practices, I think that this is just a glimpse of how deep the crisis is and the issue is. One thing that's been really interesting is I've been teaching, Piyutim and Jewish mysticism. Piyutim are Jewish liturgical songs. I started, teaching, and I have a lot of people from the Middle East region who are not Jewish who come to my classes. And they have been, coming to my classes and getting so emotional because they're like, we've been looking for Judaism that is from our lands, that we can hear the guttural sounds in the Hebrew. And every time we hear the Hebrew, it sounds a bit foreign. But when we hear the Hebrew in the Mizrachi, tones, it sounds so familiar to us. So, I think that there's also a lot of beauty in bridging the gaps there.
Yeah. I want to visit some of the areas of Jewish life where I think Sephardi and Mizrachi identities or traditions come up most regularly, or like they're most well known, because not because I think they're amazing. Like I actually think that this points to like a big problem. We're creeping up on Passover, and I wish I had like one of those ticket counters for like when people are when you're counting how many people enter an event, and I could click the button every time somebody says, "Oh, I'm Sephardic on Passover. I'm Sephardi on Passover." This is when people like Ashkenazi Jews or people who are not actually Sephardi or Mizrachi say that. And what they mean by that is not on Passover I do all sorts of interesting Sephardi traditions. I sing these melodies. They mean I eat rice, because there's this historical difference among certain communities and what they see as kosher for Passover. And many communities who are Sephardi and Mizrachi believe that rice is kosher for Passover. Most Ashkenazi communities don't. There's also splits now among Ashkenazi denominations. It's a whole thing. But suffice to say, I don't think it is like a deeply respectful, great act for somebody who is not of an identity to say, "Oh, I'm that for 7 days. I'm that for 8 days." And I think that if you ask people to like say things about Mizrachi Judaism, Sephardi Judaism, I think a lot of them would start with like, aren't they the ones that eat rice on Passover?
Yeah.
And look, I actually do think that that's like an interesting thing to talk about, and like, but like, is that the shouting to the rooftops how cool the Makam melodies are in service? No, it's not. And it's not really showing that much depth about what Sephardi and Mizrachi do. It's a knowledge about them that is marked by its distinction to Ashkenaziness. Mm-hmm. And so I guess because we're creeping up on Passover, I'd kind of love to hear your relationship to that in particular, but also more broadly what it reflects around how we might go about this differently.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the difference between Sephardic and Mizrachi, because those terminologies are thrown around a lot together, but they actually mean separate things. And both of them are actually sometimes controversial words about how we use them and why we use them. And, obviously there's a huge political landscape that they're embedded in. But, before the creation of the state of Israel, Sephardic and Ashkenazi were categories for different religious practice, right? You had the Sephardic sages, you had the Ashkenazi sages, right? Even in the times, right, the commentary of the Talmud, you have these different lineages that were basically about halakha, about Jewish law, right? Which is what you're talking about came from, right? About kitniot, about being able to eat on Passover rice or quinoa or things like that, right? That was permissible in the Sephardic tradition and restricted in the Ashkenazi tradition. And then largely you see in the legal canon that Sephardic Judaism is a lot more lenient than Ashkenazi. Like there's a lot more strictness. That those were all religious differences that for a while there wasn't really a racial difference there. It was just we live in different lands. There's different circumstances there. So therefore our laws are slightly different. But with the creation of the state of Israel, that is when the term Mizrachi came along, which was really a term, it literally translates to Easterner. Or sometimes, right, in more historical academic books, they call us the Oriental Jews. There's a lot to unpack there, but it was really a category to lump Jewish people of the whole Middle East and North Africa region into one, and actually really flatten a lot of the diversity, right? So if you're Morocco, or if you're from Yemen, or if you're from Iraq, you're the same kind of exotic Oriental Jew, because we're looking at it now from the Western Ashkenazi lens. So now what we have is that we're still figuring out, right, both the religious differences and now the added racial differences. The Ashkenazi kind of establishment in the state of Israel was incredibly racist and continues to be towards Sephardim and Mizrachim. I mean, even if you read some of the things, that were written about Sephardim and Mizrachim, and things from saying like we're not really Jewish, the Torah that we read is not really Torah, like we don't know how to practice Judaism, like, right, we're barbaric, kind of the classic Oriental tropes. And this is something that really impacted our families, like for sure impacted my parents. And it's the type of atmosphere that I grew up in, is to feel embarrassed for being Sephardic and Mizrachi. But this is still the Sephardic and Mizrachi identity, and how it relates to the Jewish world is continuously undermined. This is something that a lot of Sephardim and Mizrachim feel, and certainly something that I felt, right? We are always kind of the extra spice on the table. We're never the whole table. We're always just like the paprika on the side, so that looks all sorts of ways. That's exactly like that story you shared around, oh, on Passover, I'm Sephardic. It could also look like, okay, we're a bit bored with our Ashkenazi too. And so how about we invite, a Moroccan Jew who will bring some darbuka, some, drums, and just make it a little interesting for us. Or for Passover, another classic thing is with a charoset, because the Ashkenazi and Mizrachi communities, right, eat different types of charoset. And it tends to be that the charoset from Sephardic and Mizrachi tradition is just so good. We make the dates and the walnuts, and, there's so many different variations of it. So there's always kind of this like, oh, well, we want to be Sephardic and Mizrachi inclusive. So like, why don't you just bring your dish, right? So I feel like it ends up being that we are always just the side, and when we're invited to bring in things, it's always just in relationship to Ashkenazi Judaism. It's always like, well, how does your flavor, how can we just taste a bit of it, but not actually have to change anything about how we think about you, or how we think about Judaism, or how we think about ourselves? I was just recently reading an essay piece by this Mizrachi feminist scholar, Vicky Shiran, that she talks about feminist identity and Oriental identity and this play between them. And one of the things that she says is that, like, for her to really fully be in her Mizrachi identity, part of what that looks like is actually challenging Ashkenazim to actually own that they're Ashkenazi, right? That they're not just Jewish, but they're Ashkenazi Jewish. And I think part of what happens is that for a lot of Ashkenazi Jews, they never have to think of themselves as Ashkenazi. They just think of themselves as Jewish, because when you say Jewish, for them, the norm is that you mean Ashkenazi Jewish. But when you're Sephardic and Mizrachi Jewish, you can't just say I'm Jewish. You have to say I'm Sephardic Jewish, I'm Mizrachi Jewish, right? We have to define ourselves. And we see that with synagogues as well, right? An Ashkenazi synagogue is not going to label itself an Ashkenazi synagogue, but a Syrian synagogue is going to be like, we're a Syrian synagogue. Part of the work here is also to challenge the Ashkenazi Jewish community to say, like, hey, you are a particular flavor of Judaism, which is Ashkenazi Jewish. You are not all of Judaism.
I think that points to something important, which is like, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. My both sides of my family are from Eastern Europe, and there are Ashkenazi Jewish things that matter a great deal to me. Were part of my childhood, are part of my current life, because I thought of them as just Jewish things. Whether it's matzo ball soup or gefilte fish. So let's do Passover examples. We could do examples for like most of the year. I didn't think of those things as like my families are my kind of Jewish. I thought of it as just that's what Jewish is. And so it made me a little more distant from those things than I might have been if I really felt them as like, wow, that's something that I have had culturally and specifically, not just sort of overall Jews. All Jews eat gefilte fish, which they don't. Like, I think it actually does a disservice to Ashkenazi Jews too, the fact that they don't think of their synagogues as a kind of synagogue as opposed to like everything is like this. So that I really appreciate you bringing that. I'm also glad you brought in the word Oriental and named like all of the problems with it. Like, I want to bring up Orientalism. Edward Said is, the famous thinker behind this term, not Jewish, but like it certainly applies to Judaism in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think classically, there's a lot of dynamics where the Christian world, or those who are not Jewish and predominate, have looked at Jews and Judaism and said, look at those Jews. They're into all this like physicality and materiality and legalism. And that's so antiquated and it's so unsophisticated. And we are into ideas and the abstract and the intellect. And that's sort of the logical endgame of human civilization and everything from a long time ago. And those Jews are still doing it. Why are they still into all this like physicality? I think we know as Jews how that can be super harmful. But then within Jewish life, Ashkenazi Jews apply Orientalism to Sephardi and Mizrachi Jews. I'm not saying every Ashkenazi Jew does this. I think there's just like a general instinct that we haven't fully unpacked where like we're applying Orientalism even within Jewish life. And we're looking at certain things as like superstition or as old school or antiquated that are Mizrachi and Sephardi traditions. And then the Ashkenazi ones are like what those traditions led to. It's almost supersessionism, like in a Christian sense of like, those were the old ones and now we are better than them.
Yeah.
I think it's so bad. I think it's wrong. Like, I think it's actually terrible to think that being connected to the material, being connected to, I mean, you mentioned spiciness. Like, I think this comes up with like spices and like stuff that is sensory, stuff that connects to our bodies, to our noses, to our, like, we keep on telling ourselves in contemporary life that those are unsophisticated. They're talking to our bodies and not to our minds, not to our intellects. And so when there's entire groups of people and traditions that are really interested in the sensory, interested in the material, we diminish those communities. And so I'm kind of curious, like, my sense is you agree that's bad, but like, what's happening there? How can we, do this differently?
Well, thank you for, first of all, bringing up Palestinian thought leader Edward Said around Orientalism. I think it's so important to talk about the modern context of Orientalism, but just to look at it a bit historically, exactly as you said, right, with the rise of the Roman Christian Empire, you could apply, and you certainly, Edward Said did, right, think about Orientalism and Jewishness, and this is so much of my thought, but right, originally Jews were the people that were kind of seen as the Oriental ones, right, because they chose to hang on to the Hebrew Bible, to kind of these biblical ways that Christian Europe was trying to advance from, while Christian Europe just assumed that all Jews would be excited to convert. When Jews didn't, right? There was kind of the sense of like, oh, you're barbaric, you're holding on to the past. Why aren't you coming with us? The Jews being the backward ones. And I like how you're talking about that with that sense of materiality. You can also talk about it in terms of relationship with magic, right? Because there was always a thing of like, oh, the Jews with the rituals, what kind of magic are they doing? Right. And magic can be all sorts of things, right? It's not just all these supernatural things. It's also just lighting Shabbat candles, right? Our ritual practice was seen as very magical and mystical. And like, what are these Jews doing? As history evolved, I think that it's also really important to talk about the rise of Islam and, the orientation towards the Muslim community that then got developed through kind of Christian Europe and, in the US certainly as well. And then, of course, right, the construction of Arabs, and then right now in particular, right, also the racial structure against Palestinians. So those are all things that are related to this conversation of what's happening within the Jewish communities between Ashkenazi and Sephardic and Mizrachi. But certainly, yes, there is Orientalism from Ashkenazim towards Sephardim and Mizrachim that is really, really painful. I mean, there's so many consequences to it. But one that I think about is that, Ashkenazi Jewish European experience was really developing under the Christian world. So the relationship to Judaism was also a relationship to Christianity in some way, whether that was, a relationship of resistance, like, oh, the Christians do this, so we're not going to do that, right? But Christianity was kind of the framework. For Sephardim and Mizrachim, Islam was the framework, right? That is actually part of why Sephardim and Mizrachim tend to be more devotional and tend to be more, because so much of that is also the teachings of Islam, right? And we see this definitely with Andalusia and right, the influence, Sufism, Kabbalah, all of this. Nowadays, I think the tragedy of the time that we live in, right, that Jewish people have been just completely uprooted from Muslim societies, and we really lost a lot of that relationship to the Muslim community and Muslim people, and kind of all just, especially in the US context, it's like being in, Christian hegemony, it's like part of forgetting, or the Orientalist tropes against Sephardic and Mizrachim is also translates into Islamophobia, and also translates into like a rejection of the Muslim world and how it influenced the Jewish world. And I think that there's so much tragedy there because, Islam has influenced Judaism so deeply. And, sometimes it gets to the point that I actually think it's a bit ridiculous. We had even the Rambam himself,
Rambam referring to Maimonides, the 12th century Jewish philosopher and rabbi, Sephardic, and who lived in Spain and Morocco and Egypt.
He was writing in Arabic and he was studying the Quran. Because Arabic has kind of been taken away as a tongue from us, it's like we have also lost access to the lineage of Jewish scholarship that were writing in Arabic, that were relating to Islam. I mean, Rambam's son was a Sufi Jewish mystic. In Egypt, there was a community of Egyptian, Jewish, Sufi, Kabbalah mystics that wrote a lot about relationship to God. And I'm like, this is so beautiful, but it's so hard to access that, certainly in the North America Jewish world. Like if I wanted to actually deepen my knowledge about Sephardic and Mizrachi Judaism, not just as like, oh, this is what we eat, but like as a serious scholarship of like spirituality and tradition, there's really not places I can go to in North America. I mean, the rabbinical schools don't teach them. I had a friend who wanted to become a rabbi, but wanted to become a Sephardic rabbi and went to rabbinical schools. And in the interview asked them, like, this is what I want to deepen in. Is there space for me here? The answer was, you're going to have to create that for yourself. The fact that we don't challenge that enough in the Jewish community, to me is a problem, because what does that mean? Just because this community is from Egypt, that means in Jewish academic and scholarship and religious settings, we just dismiss it. When we're talking sometimes in the Jewish community in North America about justice and racism and how all of these factors play out in the Jewish community, we certainly leave out Ashkenormativity a lot of the time. Even the phrase Jews of color, for a long time, people were not sure. Do Sephardim and Mizrachim fit into that term? Do they not? Where are they? How are they? And part of the reason why it was so unclear is because it's been taking so long to just name Ashkenormativity as a system of racism too, right? People don't want to see that. They want to talk about whiteness, but they don't want to talk about Ashkenazi dominance. There's so much harm that ends up being done to Jews because our representation is so focused on, the typical Ashkenazi Jewish man who is anxious or neurotic, or, kind of this psychological description that we see in the media and Hollywood. Like that is the image of what the world sees of being Jewish. Part of my work has been, well, how do we redefine that? Like, what would it look like to, instead of having the Ashkenazi Jewish man be centered as what it means to be Jewish, what does it look like for like a Sephardic Jewish woman who is sensual, who is embodied being, like what it means to be Jewish. How does that change how other people think of us and relate to us?
One of our most listened to and responded to and emailed about episodes was when we featured Sean Leisha. Shouts to Sean. I know he listens. Hey, Sean. Who is sort of, I don't know, an ambassador for Karaite Judaism. And his family is from Egypt. And my own Jewish journey and experience has been influenced so deeply by my relationship to him and from that, my relationship to Karaite Judaism. And I bring it up, what's interesting is we could have a whole long conversation about like, is Karaite Judaism a Mizrachi Judaism? Like, I think sort of like it's in contemporary iterations traces largely to regions that are part of North Africa and the Middle East. And I think when we say Mizrachi Judaism, in the same way that those synagogues don't say that they're Ashkenazi synagogues, I think when we talk about kinds of Judaism, we tend not to say that they're rabbinic Judaisms. We just take that for granted that they're rabbinic. But I bring it up because when I was introduced to this and learned about a Judaism that was historically shaped by, Hebrew, but also its relationship to Arabic, by forms of prayer, including like full prostration that are seen as, oh, Muslims do that, Jews don't do that. It turns out Jews do that in many traditions. My own Jewish experience as somebody who is not ethnically or genealogically Karaite was altered in a deeply positive way, both because I was introduced to new interpretations of texts and new rituals that I didn't know about, that I actually embrace myself, and because I grew to appreciate the rabbinicness of many of my, like the things that I thought, again, were just what Jews do. I was introduced to, oh, that's actually a rabbinic way of thinking. And there's like a magic, there's a specificity, there's an amazingness to rabbinic Jewish interpretation, to reading between the lines, to going beyond just what the original text does, which Karaites, they tend to stay more in what the original text of the Bible does. And so I grew to appreciate the magic of certain rabbinic things that I thought were just Jewish things. I do want to throw in the complication of cultural appropriation. It's one of the most discussed things in certainly Jewish online discourse now. Something is happening where I think a lot of people feel drawn to learn more about Sephardi and Mizrachi Jewishness or other kinds of Jewishness that are not Ashkenazi or not rabbinic, but they're not doing it because to do so feels like it would be an appropriative, disrespectful act. And I think intellectually, like, no, learning about something, appreciating it is not appropriation, but it feels like, wait, am I going to go and like just sort of make a bunch of Mizrachi foods or do it? Like, is that my place? Can I do, like, people are nervous about this. And I feel like we have to talk about it because I don't think it serves anyone to like stay away from marginalized traditions because we're nervous about appropriation. I don't think that actually does anything positive, but it's still, we don't want people just saying I'm Sephardic for 7 days. Yeah. In that kind of appropriation. So how do we navigate that?
So I actually created a whole project about prostrations in the Jewish lineage because of my Sephardic and Mizrachi roots.
Yes, and it's in the show notes.
Yeah, because I was in this discourse about, right, embodied prayer and this relationship to embodied prayer in Judaism. And it actually comes from in Israeli society, one of the racial tropes that is said about Mizrachi people is that we prostrate on the graves of our ancestors. That was like how they demeaned us, is by saying this line. And as I was kind of unpacking all the racism that I received from Israeli society, I kind of came back to that line and I was like, wait, why is that a diss to say that I'm prostrating on my ancestor's grave? There was something all of a sudden that I found so beautiful in it, is this relationship to ancestry, this relationship to prayer. And from that, I actually set up this whole project to research. I started actually asking academics, do you know anything about prostrations in Judaism? And I realized that this was really under-researched also. But then when you look at biblical and rabbinic scholarship, there is actually so much. And I mean, it's just in plain sight that I, ended up writing like a 50-page document about all this research. So, this is also the type of gold mine that I feel can be found if we allow for these conversations to really seep in. wow, there is a really sacred answer here to a very deep crisis within Judaism, which is about embodied prayer. And here we have a whole lineage, right, that gives us so much to think about. So I think that we are in a massive Jewish crisis about our relationship to God, our relationship to spirit, but really our relationship to our hearts. And, sometimes that translates into, what you were naming earlier of the intellectualization, like, oh, we're people of the book, oh, we use the mind. But I actually don't think that that's a accurate understanding of who Jewish people are. Our whole tradition is about ritual, and relationship to fire, relationship to water, there's actually a lot of embodiment in there, but somehow we've been convinced that we are just of the mind and that we need to get into the body and that, these things weren't there. And I think part of that is very connected to this relationship between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrachim. And I see this even with my own family. My grandfather was a prayer leader in the Syrian tradition, and I grew up in a very, very devotional home. And my dad was a quantum physicist, very scientific mind. I always grew up with these things being in harmony. That's where we can think about Arab societies like inventing algebra and astrology and astronomy, and at the same time also developing poetry and philosophy and mysticism and the unity of these things. Now, the other thing I wanted to name is that you said about cultural appropriation and all of that. First, when thinking about Sephardic and Mizrachi communities, I think this is where the tension is, right? Because certainly, okay, in the US context, we are a minority. But if you are looking at it in the Israeli context, we are actually the majority. The majority of Jewish people in Israel are actually Sephardi and Mizrachi, which creates a lot of tensions for Americans who have all these fantasies about Israel, and then they go, and then all of a sudden they're confronted with a Sephardic and Mizrachi society. And they're not used to that because they're like, wait, what happened? The way that people think there is they're like, oh, Mizrachim are the marginalized ones. And it's like, yeah, we are marginalized, but we're marginalized by power, not by numbers. That is actually a big distinction, which, leads me to talk about the cultural appropriation thing, right? Honoring someone else's lineage by learning about it, that's not an issue. The issue is the power difference that is there that has societal consequences. So for me, and I see this a lot in North American Jewish communities. It's like I get so excited because I see a Sephardic feature, and then I see that the person leading it is Ashkenazi. And I've been in many spaces like that. And it's frustrating because it's like, yeah, of course I'm happy that there's Sephardic rituals, there's Sephardic knowledge that's coming more to the table. But why can't you actually hire a Sephardic person to teach that? Why can't you actually bring in Sephardic people into leadership? And probably we will shift how Judaism is going to look, right? And maybe there's something scary there. But I think more than scary, there's actually something that's beautiful. So, this is also where, and this is in the Orientalism, right, is the exotification of a people is very connected to the demonization of a people. So when people come to me and they're so excited by the charoset or by the song or by that this, and they exotify it, I know that comes with a certain demonization of my people.
Yeah. Oh, man. So you're a Jewish mystic. If I remember right, I'm not looking at it right now, but when I was looking at your bio, I think you call yourself a mystic as one of the first nouns, right?
Yeah, that is correct.
So I'm also a mystic. And so I'm curious to hear more from you about what that means in terms of your Jewish experience and how it relates to all of these threads that we're bringing up. I mean, I'll break the fourth wall for a second. You and I had a lovely conversation at the Association for Jewish Studies conference where we were going back and forth about what material are you going to teach in the yeshiva. I knew that I wanted you to teach, and I was like, there's 11 different angles we could go. And so I'm kind of curious to get a hint of if we had gone the direction of you teaching your 3-week mini course on Jewish mysticism, what might that look like? And I guess, I'm curious about it as it relates to Sephardi and Mizrachiness. I'm also just curious about it generally. You mentioned this crisis of relationship to God in Jewish life. I agree. But I think if I were to rank crises in Jewish life, which is such a fun exercise, right? Listeners,
Yeah.
Let's all rank our Jewish crises. I would put that lower. I do care about my relationship to God. My sense is that we disagree on that. And that's why I'm excited. We have a lot of different listeners out there. people who are mystics, people who are rationalists, people who are, I don't use any of those terms, I don't think a lot about God. What does it mean to be a Jewish mystic? How does it inform your way of navigating the world? And why might it be important for us to at least have a sense of our own orientation to our relationship to God?
Yeah. Well, first, I love that exercise of ranking Jewish crisis. We should, I'll do that as an icebreaker at the next conference. Well, okay, first I want to start by just the word mystic, because my relationship to Jewish mysticism is also in relationship to other religious forms of mysticism, right? Part of what I think makes me a mystic is the openness also to, and perhaps you actually share this with me, right? This relationship to also honoring interfaith and honoring other forms of religion. And there's a certain reverence and respect there. And that is the mystical path to me, which is really, I mean, you could think about it in all sorts of ways. One way is to think about it as a path of the heart. So many, and this is actually a huge part of, I would say, Sephardic Kabbalah, right? When we don't say that God abandoned us, we just say that God is hidden. El Mistater, which is the song that opens the Sephardic Bakashot, the Syrian Bakashot, which is a service that happens between Hanukkah and Passover and every Shabbat, and goes by the tree of life of the Kabbalistic Sfirot and the aspects of God. But it starts by saying God that is hidden, God that is hiding from us, right? Which is in relationship to the winter months as well. But what does that mean when the presence of God is hiding? And that to me is the challenge of the mystic, right? The mystic has faith in God, but can see that God is also hiding. So then the mystic becomes a seeker. Hey, I want to see the face of God. How can I do that? Right? And then they go on all sorts of adventures that are unknown and playful. And some of them are more challenging to the underworld, the psyche, the shadow work, all of it. But it's really about uncovering the face of God again. Not just like, oh, I believe in God and then that's it. And then I just do my rituals. But like, I actually want a closeness, an intimacy. So the closeness and the intimacy can actually only happen through experience. I can't just intellectualize it and have these theories about it. I actually have to live it. And I get that the word God can feel really challenging, right? To certain people, it's like so scary, like, oh my God. But, I think that there's something.
Did you do that on purpose? The like, oh my God? Because that was
I didn't,
delightful.
no, but
that was
it just
delightful.
happened. But that's the thing, is that like we actually do call on God all the time without being aware of it,
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I'm just like, can we just be aware that we're actually already calling out to God? But I think that tension is actually really heightened when I come into multi-religious spaces. And one of the first questions I am asked by non-Jews is, hey, Hadar, can you tell us about Jewish relationship to God? Because when I ask my Jewish people about God, it seems like they don't really want to talk about it. But then I'm confused because isn't it a religion, and isn't religion all about God? And I think in so many other traditions, I mean, certainly Christianity, Islam, but not just, God is the main character of the religion. And in Judaism, it's actually unclear, So
Mm-hmm.
there's something there that I think is really, really interesting to be worked out. So much of my relationship to mysticism does come from Kabbalah. And Kabbalah literally means to receive God. It literally is about receiving God and receiving God directly. I don't think that Kabbalah is about reading the latest books that came out talking about it, right? It's a certain level of practice. I get really frustrated that when I desire to learn more about Kabbalah, it's usually by Ashkenazim, and it's usually a very, very academic, intellectualized understanding of Kabbalah. And I'm always like, where is the practice? Where are the people doing the breathing techniques, the chanting the names of God, visualization, all of these things? Like, what about all these as practices? And, that got answered to me when I started investing more in being in Mizrachi community. Communities have actually been practicing Kabbalah in a very literal, embodied way. Till this day, there are still communities who practice it. Why are the teachers of Kabbalah these days not actually prioritizing, centering, sometimes even acknowledging the Sephardic origination of Kabbalah, the Sephardic sages, the practices, the embodied practices that led to Kabbalah, right? Why isn't there more research around Sephardic communities and how they practice Kabbalah in an embodied way? How is that just completely left out?
The last question I have, I mean, if I remember right, you and I first met digitally because we were both working on all-night Shavuot events the middle of 2020. And we were thrilled to find each other because, you were working on this thing called Feminism All Night, and I was working on Shavuot Live. I bring it up because your Shavuot observance that you organized that year, and I think potentially after that year too, it was Feminism All Night. It was a consciously politicized effort. And I think one thing that I struggle with, not just with Sephardi and Mizrachi cultural programs and things, like a lot of people doing programmatic work featuring Sephardi and Mizrachi voices or music or food or whatever, it's framed as quote unquote culture, which is good, but there's this attempt to really depoliticize. There's this sense of like, we can all get along and bond over eating different kinds of foods together, singing different kinds of things together, and so we should diversify the tapestry of the melodies and the foods, and like that's good impulse. But what I'm so grateful for with this class you're about to teach is that this is very much not a politicsless class. We need to politicize our work around empowering different kinds of voices and groups in Jewish life. It would be lovely if we could just do this without any sense of analyzing power dynamics, that we could just, here's some cool melodies. But there's a reason why we have Beyond Ashkenormativity in that title. This doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is part of a context in which, as you said, Sephardi and Mizrachi Jews are very regularly targeted by racism in Jewish societies. I guess my closing question is, why is it so important to bring in political analysis when we're talking about this work that sometimes is just talked about as like inclusion work?
Well, so it's impossible to do the inclusion without the political discourse, because what we're talking about is politics. It is structures of power. It is these racial dynamics. So if we're trying to talk about this without actually acknowledging systemic oppression, and I've found this in many Jewish spaces who try to do that without really fully going into these conversations, they just end up backfiring. Someone ends up getting really hurt because, there isn't enough awareness of how deep these dynamics go. And, they're just trying to kind of cover up, trying to kind of fit a checklist without really doing the work, which is actually hard work. I think that sometimes when we think about inclusion, it sounds so easy. It's like, oh, let's just include everybody. No problem. That requires such deep self-investigative work around who we are, how we're acting, and that's not easy. Now, I also want to say that I think that part of why it's really hard for the Jewish community to really acknowledge these dynamics with Sephardic and Mizrachi communities is because it is so embedded in the conversation about Israel and Zionism. Why is Arabic not seen as a Jewish language anymore? Arabic is a Jewish language. Like, why is it not part of our canon? Why are we not teaching it in Hebrew schools just as we are teaching other languages, right? Because there's some way in which Arabic became, quote unquote, the language of the enemy. A lot of Mizrachi activists talk about that, you're trying to understand what is happening and you get really confused because you're relating to your grandma and then you're fed this narrative about who the enemy is. And then you start realizing that your grandma and your enemy are actually very similar. So this big existential crisis that has been happening to Sephardic and Mizrachi communities is not just about, oh, we don't feel included. Asking the Jewish community to really confront that is really asking them to confront, maybe one of the top things that you would rank in the crises of the Jewish people, which is relationship to Zionism and the state of Israel. For me, I just think that there's no other way. The cost of not having these conversations and not acknowledging these dynamics is way, way, way too high. And I feel this. I feel so much pain and so much loss and so much heartbreak. I mean, in the next generation, because the older folks pre-48 are basically dying off right now, if we don't do this preservation of our culture, of our memory, of our lineage, it's just not going to happen because the Jewish community has not been investing in it. So it's kind of been dependent on individual people to do on a grassroots. Oftentimes we're very much not funded. So it literally has to be just like people choosing to do this on their own, to like record our grandparents, to like preserve Judeo-Arabic, to preserve our languages, to preserve our ways of meshing Arabic and Hebrew and Ladino and all of these things. Like, this is not light work, we've been kind of, and I feel that, that the inherited responsibility of preserving thousands of years of lineage that the Jewish community has just been completely not interested in preserving. And there's something so tragic about it. I mean, especially when I really learn about what was happening in Aleppo and in Baghdad and in Cairo. I mean, these are central Jewish cities to our memory. The fact that it's just undercover right now, or it's too political to talk about, or whatever it may be, it's actually not acceptable. And with all that, again, I do acknowledge that that is a big ask, right? To kind of get embedded in Israel-Palestine politics, which is not just Israel-Palestine politics, but also the politics of the region. So I get why it's overwhelming. And this is part of why Sephardic and Mizrachi voices are absolutely essential in leadership. Sephardim and Mizrachim are a bridge between the Ashkenazi Jewish world and the Arab world. Like, that's the role we can take if people actually allow us to take that role instead of squashing us from that. I always talk about how I feel like my identity is situated and it's caught between the Holocaust and the Nakba. And it's this awkward thing because neither of them is my history, but also neither of them is not my history at the same time. What is it to actually have space for my story, and how does it make us see this reality differently in the region? I think that there's a huge, huge opportunity here to actually allow Sephardic and Mizrachi voices to lead in the Jewish community.
Thank you so much, Hadar Cohen, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Lex, for having me, and Judaism Unbound. So happy to be here.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. First things first, before we close out, this course with Hadar Cohen, the amazing guest you just heard from, you can sign up. You should sign up. We really hope you'll sign up. You should head to judaismunbound.com/classes and just click on the option for Sephardic and Mizrachi Identities Beyond Ashkenormativity taught by Hadar Cohen. There are also our other 3-week mini course options that you can check out at judaismunbound.com/classes. So head there, learn what our offerings are for this wonderful time between Passover and Shavuot that we think should be deliberately devoted to Jewish learning and unlearning. We've got lots of great things coming up. So with that, we're going to close out this conversation, and in doing so, encourage you to be in touch with us. You can do so in any of the following ways: our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, to check out the show notes for this episode, including all sorts of links to Hadar Cohen's work and other related articles and juicy information. You can email us at lex@judaismunbound.com. I know I was the only one here today, but also dan@judaismunbound.com if you want to be in touch with both of the co-hosts of this podcast. And we love it when you send us your questions, your thoughts, your visions. It serves our organization and it serves the Jewish future, we think. So thank you so much for listening. And the last thing that we'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.